Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the fourth in our series for Black History Month. My name is Nanette Sawyer, and I'm one of the pastors here at Fourth Church. Joining me today is Derrick Dawson, who works with Crossroads, which is a national organization doing anti-racism work, and his primary responsibility is working with Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism, CROAR, which has worked with Fourth Church a lot as we look into how racism is embedded in some of the practices and policies of our church, and how can we become more anti-racist and more expansively welcoming and inclusive, and actually be an anti-racist church too. So we've been doing a lot of work together, and we're delighted to have him here with us today for this class. And before we get started, I want to just begin with a word of prayer. Gracious and loving God, we are so grateful that you have brought us together today. We come with hearts longing to know and to experience our connection to you and to each other as the beloved community, as your beloved children. We pray that you would open our hearts and illumine our minds. We pray that you would give us courage and compassion for ourselves and for each other as we continue to grow and learn together. And we give you thanks, God, that you are indeed with us this day and each day, that you have been with us since you knit us together in our mother's wombs, and you will indeed be with us into eternity. And so we thank you, and we praise your holy name. Amen. So, what you can expect today, we're talking about LGBTQIA leadership in the civil rights movement, and we're going to be defining our terms for you. We're going to be introducing you to some people. We actually had to do a lot of research to figure out how to teach this class, so we're going to share with you where we are as of today. So as we begin, I welcome Derrick, and if you want to say a word or two about the work you do, that might be great, and then take it away.
I can do that. So as an organizer trainer for Crossroads, which is a national organization that does anti-racism work focusing primarily on systems and institutions like Fourth Presbyterian Church. And I do that work all over the country, but my primary responsibility is to co-lead Chicago Regional Organizing for Anti-Racism, CROAR, in looking at an institution's policies, procedures, and programs, and moving further away from thinking about racism as being more individual and more systemic. So that's the work that I do. And we've been working with Fourth Pres for, I don't know, a few years now. And it's always good to be with you, so I appreciate the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
So we want to define our terms, and first we're going to start with this long string of letters that confuses a lot of people.
There is a long string of letters, and I think it's, as we walk through these, just to make sure that we understand some of the language that we'll be using during this hour, it's important to understand that these terms have changed and change over time, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But first I want to start with the basics, which is gay. Let's start there. And gay simply means a person who is attracted to the person of the same sex. And gay can be men or women, but in more recent years we have been using the term lesbian for women who are attracted to other women, and gay for men who are attracted to other men, although gay and lesbian both fall under gay. Another thing to understand about all these terms is that we need to begin to understand sexuality as being fluid. And so the fact that a person identifies as gay or lesbian one day does not mean that they are gay or lesbian forever. Sometimes it is fluid, sometimes it changes, and we want to make sure that we don't put people in a box that's comfortable for us and expect them to stay there. And that is true for most of these terms. The next one, oh, I'm sorry, I'm on the wrong page here. I talked about gay and lesbian, so let's talk about bisexual. So bisexual is a person who is attracted to both sexes. Obviously, bisexual means that a woman who is attracted to both men and women, or a man who is attracted to both men and women. Transgender is a person who does not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So if a transgender person is a person who may have been born and identified as a boy at birth, but identifies as being a female, or a person who is identified as a female at birth, but feels an affinity but feels that they are a female as opposed to the gender that they were assigned at birth. Transgender, sometimes referred to as trans, never transgendered with a D at the end. The reason for that is transgendered would imply that that something has happened to a person. We say transgender or trans because being trans is just part of a person's identity. It is who they are, a trans person. Queer. Queer is an interesting one because queer can mean any of these things. Queer often means that a person does not want to be identified narrowly by society's standards or language. So queer can be bisexual, queer can be gay, queer can be lesbian, queer can be transsexual. And queer is often used for young people. Most of us remember when queer was a pejorative. Queer was one of the worst things that you can call a gay person. But queer in more recent years has been used to say, I will not be put into a box. Even sometimes straight people use the word queer to say that I will not be identified or labeled in a particular way according to what you perceive my sexuality to be. So queer is an umbrella term that often includes any or all of those identifiers. Questioning. Questioning simply means that a person is not sure. Sexuality is often fluid. A person can go through many changes in trying to understand their identity. I can be questioning whether I'm gay or lesbian or trans, and it's sometimes a lifelong journey. So a person who is questioning their sexuality is called questioning. That's what the Q stands for. Intersex. Intersex simply means that a person is born with characteristics of both sexes. Sometimes they have genitalia that can be identified as both male and female, or something else is going on with their genitalia. It is not a disease necessarily. It simply means that a person has characteristics of both sexes, male and female.
And I would add that sometimes it can be a chromosomal difference. So some people are born with XXY or XYY rather than just XX or XY. And so about 2% of the population is born with some kind of difference like this, whether it's physical or genetic, chromosomal.
And one of the reasons it's important to understand that difference is because it is not something that necessarily needs to be medically corrected or medically addressed in any way. Asexual is a person who does not necessarily have sexual attraction. They do not necessarily feel a strong attraction toward either male or female. They are asexual, which means they are indifferent to sexuality. They are not necessarily attracted or want to have sex with either men or women. They are just asexual.
And some people use the word ally.
Yes. Ally is an interesting word also. Ally, for the A, means that a person is not necessarily queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, but they support the work and the communities that are. So they might be referred to as an ally. Sometimes allies will also call themselves queer to show their support for the LGBTQI community. Now there are many, many other words that we use, and some of them are slang terms. Nanette and I were talking about Friends of Dorothy. Anybody familiar with that term, Friends of Dorothy? Some Friends of Dorothy is a term back in the day, particularly in the 40s around World War II, when being gay was illegal, gay people referred to themselves as friends of Dorothy. You may understand that Dorothy is a reference to Judy Garland, who was a gay icon, particularly in the 40s. And so one of the ways people would refer to each other in secret would be a friend of Dorothy. He is a friend of Dorothy. That's the way some people were sometimes introduced to communicate that they were gay and lesbian communities without actually what we would call outing someone today. Another one Nanette let me know of today that I had never heard of was...
A member of the choir.
A member of the choir.
Are they a member of the choir? Yes, they are.
The same reference to Dorothy, sometimes gay people might be referred to as Judy. He is a Judy, she is a Judy. That's another reference, a surreptitious reference for LGBTQ people. Another one is cisgender. Cisgender is basically the opposite of transgender. Cisgender, C-I-S-G-E-N-D-E-R, simply means that you do not see yourself as the gender that you were assigned at birth. And so it just means that you do not identify with what you were labeled when you were born. Cisgender.
That's trans.
I'm sorry, transgender. I'm sorry. Yeah. What did I say? Cisgender means that you do not identify with the gender that you were that you do identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. Yeah. Cisgender, thank you. Mm-hmm. And non-binary simply means that you do not identify or do not want to be identified in a male-female binary. And it just means that you are non-binary, and it could be physical, it could be that this is a choice that you have made. It just means that you do not want to be labeled male or female. Right. There are others that could be in there. There are all kinds. There's pansexual, which means that you are attracted to people all across the spectrum of sexuality. And there are others that might be included in this list. And this list is constantly changing. And the reason it's changing constantly is because these are not necessarily hard or fixed rules for sexuality. And as people, particularly younger people, express their sexuality in different ways, these words are used to identify them and for them to identify themselves. And so all kinds of words come up, and all you have to do is Google these letters and you'll find a list of all of them if you ever need a reference for how they're being used.
So you see that string has just gotten longer and longer and longer over time because we're trying to be inclusive of all people, and because we recognize a kind of fluidity in sexuality, that it's not just that there are men who are clearly men and women who are clearly women in terms of gender. It's not just that people are always attracted to one kind of person. So we're trying to work with that in terms of language. It can become frustrating if you feel like you're always trying to do the right thing, and you might not always do the right thing because you might not know what words people prefer. And so it's just, it's important to just recognize that and try to find out what it means to people and how they want to be addressed.
Yeah, sometimes you'll see language like LGBTQIA+, and the plus is not a mathematical symbol. It just expresses that there are more sexualities than can be included in any list. That's what that plus might mean if you say that. If you see that.
Yeah.
Is there a differentiation between transgender and transsexual? They're just...
Yeah, we used to use the word homosexual. Homosexual fell out of favor because it started to feel and sound very clinical. Transsexual is similar. Transsexual and transgender are the same, or identify the same people, but transsexual is an older term that began to feel more clinical and less humane, and so the term has shifted towards transgender for that reason.
That's a good question.
And when did gay come? Because when, in my grandmother's era, that just meant happy, you know, right. And he was homosexual. And so when did gay come into the fore?
I don't actually know the answer to that.
I don't actually know the answer to that either. Yeah, Google that. Mm-hmm. Google that.
I can hold this question until the end. I'd like to do that, but it's for kids here. I was wondering if you could speak to the new preferences around pronouns, and see if people are, expressing a preference for different pronouns.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and pronouns are definitely related to these letters. And there are some actually very good books written about the pronouns. But basically, people are using pronouns so that they can express how they want to be identified or how they identify themselves. The English language is very, very limited in the expression of pronouns. And I should be able to articulate this better in a short sentence because I studied linguistics in college. But basically, because the language is limited, we don't have words to express the kind of gender fluidity that people want to be identified. So often what gets confusing is using the word they, which has actually technically always been possible, but we only have ways to identify he, she, her, and hers, and him, and that does not capture, for instance, all kinds of other ways, and sexuality is one of them. And so identifying myself as they expresses that I'm non-binary, or that even though I may appear to you to be a female, I may identify myself as cisgender. And so the personal pronoun is changing to make that connection between the two.
And Merriam-Webster Dictionary has actually started using the word they as singular. It is starting to change in our language, and we've been through this before with the word you. You remember there used to be the time we would say thee and thy and thou for singular you, but then the plural you became also used in singular cases. Now we're doing it with the he, she is sort of like the thee, thy, the singular, but we're starting to use the plural they for singular and talk about what do they know, what do they want, what's their favorite meal or whatever, but it means one person. So it's a linguistic shift. And it's still the same plural. It's both now. Yeah, it can be both. And the same is true of you. It used to be you was only the plural. Whenever you said you meant y'all. If you meant just one person, you said thee. So good questions, great questions. So we want to talk about the social context of the civil rights movement and the LGBT community. Now we're talking about back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there was something called the Lavender Scare, which was about the same time as the Red Scare. You may remember the anti-communism movement. But people who were queer, I'm going to use modern language, people who were homosexual, actually, is the word they probably would have used, were considered subversive. They were often connected with the Communist Party. I mean, people would make that connection and just sort of name the subversive people. It began to be used as a tool against people to frighten them. There was an executive order passed in 1953 which said that homosexual people could not work for the federal government, and thousands of people lost their jobs, and people had to start signing things that said they were not homosexual. And that was in place from 1953 until 1995, when President Clinton instituted the don't ask, don't tell. They took away the asking part. You couldn't target a person. That's when it became a changed policy in 1955. So that's just a little bit of the context. The American Psychological Association said that homosexuality was a disease, and I guess that's all I'll say right now because I don't have all the words in front of me, but it was considered a disease.
The one thing I would add, Nanette, is that often instead of using the word homosexual, particularly politicians in the 50s during the whole communist scare, the code language would be immoral.
Immoral.
So homosexuality was listed, was often tied to being immoral, and that's the word that they would use. So they would say this person is being charged with immoral acts, which meant they were having sex with a person of the same sex, so they would be okay.
Marilyn.
American Psychiatric Association didn't drop the term of a mental disorder until 1974.
1974, thank you. It was a mental disorder until 1974. So we're going to move us along here and talk about civil rights movement. So we're going to see the intersection of that Lavender Scare with the civil rights movement. So 1954, Brown versus Board of Education. Emmett Till was brutally murdered in 1955. The Montgomery Bus Boycott happened December 1955 to 1956 December. 381 days, a little bit longer than 1 year. Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded in 1957. The Greensboro sit-ins at the lunch counter started in 1960. Then the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was founded in 1960 to try to organize all the students who were doing these sit-ins and to try to make it more of a mass movement and coordinate it, make it happen in more cities to have a bigger impact. The Freedom Rides on the buses started in 1961. The ones, well, we're going to talk about ones that happened earlier than that, but those are the ones where we see pictures of burned out buses and integrated bus trips that people were trying to take to challenge the segregation on the buses. The March on Washington was 1963, Martin Luther King's famous I Have a Dream speech. 8 days after that, the 4 girls were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. I almost said Bombingham, that I learned recently. That was what Birmingham got called at that time because there were so many bombs targeting civil rights activists and African American people. That was 8 days after the March on Washington. But those were 2 pivot points that tipped things, and we got to the Civil Rights Act in 1964, and in 1965, the Voting Rights Act. But one of the points we want to make is that's not the end of the civil rights movement. It carries on, and it goes on into today as well. And in fact, a lot happened before we got to that decade. Those were 10 very significant years in the civil rights movement, but they're not the civil rights movement. That's why I put the in quotes there. So we remember these highlights, but a whole lot more happened to bring us to that point. So.
Now, as we continue on, before we go too much further, we want to talk a little bit about white supremacy. Because it's important to understand white supremacy in order to set the context. Now, when I use the words white supremacy, what do you think about first?
Go ahead and be brave.
If I say white supremacist, what comes to mind?
KKK.
KKK.
George Wallace.
George Wallace, patriarchy, all of those neo-Nazis, exactly. And we are often socialized to think about that. And the reason for that is that if we think about it that way, then white supremacy is about those nasty, evil, bad people and has nothing to do with us. When we talk about white supremacy, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about that, but primarily what we're talking about when we talk about white supremacy is an ideology that this country was founded under. And it simply means that white people are socialized to believe that they are superior to people of color. And that has been built into our system. It's sort of in our DNA. And so we want to frame this conversation in that way so that we are clear that everything that we're talking about is about resistance to white supremacy. We have a short video that we want to show you to help communicate this message about what white supremacy really means in this context. This is a young man named Guante. He's a spoken word artist who lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And he's going to help us understand what we mean by white supremacy.
Can people see that, or do we need the lights off?
The lights would help a little.
Okay. Marilyn's got the lights. Oops.
How to explain white supremacy to a white supremacist. Sometimes you are a lit match dropped into a boiling ocean. Sometimes you are a stray dog proud of the sunrise after a long night of barking at the moon. Sometimes you scream at the television, shadowbox, mushroom clouds, your hand-to-hand hatred outclassed, outdated. You, post-apocalyptic litter bug. You, venomous spider in the basement of a burning building. You, whose anger is so vast and so empty. All teeth and no mouth, no jaw muscles, just that white rattle. Remember, white supremacy is not a shark. It's the water. It is How we talk about racism as white hoods and Confederate flags, knowing that you own those things and we don't. As if we didn't own this history too, this system. We tread water and you chum in a bucket. How many skinheads do you think are in the room when they said immigration law? Or decide curriculum for public schools, or push policies like redlining, mandatory minimum sentencing, benign neglect, gentrification, broken windows, policing, voter ID, stop and frisk, 3 strikes, the drug war. Remember, the eye of the hurricane is the least destructive part. You, meanest glare in the chat room, all poker face and no cards. Was it your politically incorrect YouTube comment that made the median net worth of black families in this country 9% the median net worth of white families? Which individual Donald Trump bigot boogeyman are we supposed to be angry at about the millions of people impacted by discrimination in housing and banking and education and employment and the criminal justice system each year? Remember, sharks kill about 1 person each year. Thousands drown. So, when there is a new name hashtag each week, when police create more black stars than Hollywood, how long do we keep pointing out the bad apples, ignoring the fact that the orchard was planted on a mass grave? And that we planted it there. Because of course, this isn't really a poem for white supremacists, right? Like, I don't know any white supremacists, but I know a lot of people in my neighborhood and in my family, and I know myself, and I know how white supremacy is upheld, whether through our action, our inaction, or just through paying our tuition and taxes. How it isn't just the broken treaty, it is also the treaty. How a gavel can speak as loudly as a grenade. How a white frat boy in blackface on Halloween and his friend, who knows it's wrong but doesn't say anything, begin to blur together. How the real racists today are very often not even racist. Those teeth, sharper when smiling, sharper still when smiling and meaning it. Burning cross is so dramatic. Just say, I don't see race. Just say, we all have an equal chance if we just work hard. Just say, all lives matter. Just say nothing. Surround yourself with others who say nothing and convince yourself that silence is the only song, this muted underwater melody, this pulsing quiet. And when a chorus blooms in Baltimore, when trumpets sound in Ferguson, in Minneapolis, when every one of our cities breaks into song, will we hear it? Will we choose to listen? Or will we just continue treading water, watching for that great white shark, not realizing that we're drowning?
So the folks that Nanette and I are going to be talking about during our time together are not just the George Wallaces or the Klans. They're also fighting a culture of white supremacy in the United States. Not just people who are wearing white hoods, but people who go to work every day and are just living their lives like the rest of us. So that context is important. Now, Nanette said that the civil rights movement that we often think about during the 1960s is only a part of the civil rights movement, but the ground was laid well before then. And I want to go back and talk about a period that we call Plessy versus Ferguson. You might be familiar with the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. It was a Supreme Court case in 1896. Is anybody familiar with this case?
I'm from New Orleans.
You're from New Orleans, so you know all about it, right?
I know Phoebe Ferguson and Keith Plessy.
Awesome, okay.
Their
So,
descendants can work together now for racial reconciliation.
yeah, fantastic. And succinctly, there was a Sleeping Car Act in Louisiana, which said that it was illegal for black people to ride in the same rail car as white people. And so there was a concerted effort to overturn that and other laws. And so a group of people organized to have a black man whose name was Homer Plessy, who was 7/8, I believe, 7/8 white, but because of the one-drop rule, he was an African American who looked white. He sat in the white car and was promptly arrested. It was orchestrated. And that began, that case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court declared that as long as equal accommodations were provided, it was indeed constitutional. And so in that year, in 1896, the United States actually becomes an apartheid nation, separate by law. And now, 1954, you all recognize as the year of Brown versus Board of Education, when the Supreme Court declared that separate can never be equal. Now, in order for this to happen, a lot of organizing had to occur between the period of 1896 to 1954. It actually starts a little bit earlier than that, but I want to go through some quick facts of things that happened during that period. And I'm doing this so that we can understand the efforts that required to get from Plessy to Brown versus Board of Education. Now, I want to start a little bit earlier than that with talking about Reconstruction. The Civil War ended in 1865, and that period was followed by a brief period that we call Reconstruction. This was a period when black folks and white folks were actually working together to build a society. Sometimes when you hear that this was the first black senator since Reconstruction, it's because this period was a period when all kinds of black folk were making amazing strides. There were governors and there were senators all over the United States, particularly in the South. Some white folks were not happy with this arrangement, and various things happened, the Louisiana Compromise, the Atlanta Compromise, et cetera. One of the reasons that Reconstruction happened was after the Civil War, the southern states that you see in this image wanted to rejoin the Union. And the United States said that you can rejoin the Union as long as you agree to uphold the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. After a while, though, people were getting upset with black folks sort of feeling and experiencing their own freedom. The United States government and the Atlanta Compromise pulled out of the South, and Reconstruction quickly ended, and the white folks in the South decided for economic reasons and power reasons that they should finally reoppress black people in the South. So Reconstruction ended and a period of Jim Crow started. And Jim Crow was a period from 1877 until the mid-1960s. There was a social caste system that operated not necessarily by a series of laws, but it became a way of life. And that's what led to the Louisiana Sleeping Car Act, saying that black people and white people could not ride in the same car. So this is all going on in the mid-1877 until the mid-1960s. And then you have things like the Howard University Law School was formed in 1867. I've got two images here. One is Charles Hamilton Houston. He was the dean of Howard University Law School who declared that the law was supposed to be about social engineering. And so he recruited young black men from all over the country to become lawyers to overturn laws like Plessy versus Ferguson. One of his students was a good friend named Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston built Howard University Law School to engage in social engineering and overturning unjust laws. There was something called the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. This was established so that people could learn how to organize. In order for Plessy versus Ferguson to be overturned, Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall knew that they had to take advantage of not only laws and build case laws, but they had to take advantage of cultural shifts. And so they established Highlander Folk School in order to train people like Rosa Parks in order to do nonviolent resistance and organizing. This is also where a lot of the music of the civil rights movement was written. What would the civil rights movement look like without songs like We Shall Overcome? These songs and people like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan were trained to write these songs and write protest songs at the Highlander Folk School during this period. The NAACP was formed during this period, which was led by W.E.B. Du Bois. And the NAACP was actually formed because one of the things that were happening during Jim Crow was an increase of lynching in the United States. Lynching was used as a form of intimidation to keep black people in their place and intimidate them into backing away from asking for justice and equality. So the NAACP was formed for this reason. We have Ida B. Wells Drive in Chicago now. Ida B. Wells was a journalist who documented lynching as intimidation as opposed to just a law and order tactic.
So we're talking about all of this history because when we talk about queer leadership in the civil rights movement, we're talking about the intersection of identities and the intersection of oppressions. So if you think about our identities, we have a racial identity, we have our sexuality identity, our gender identity, we have our type of ability identity, our class identity. All of these things intersect, our identities overlap. I am both white and a woman and a lesbian. And so the various oppressions all affect me in different ways. This idea of intersectionality was developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School. At different times she has served in those places. And she created this idea of intersectionality to talk about, for example, a black woman who goes to get a job in a factory and she can't get a job and sues for discrimination, but in the courts they say, well, they hire women, so it can't be that kind, and they hire black people, but it can't be that kind of oppression, but all the women are white and work in the front, and all the blacks are men and they work in the back. Where does she go as a black woman? Intersectionality gives her a particular identity and particular challenges in the way that she is excluded or integrated into society. So I think we'll talk about how the Harlem Renaissance then, I mean, I don't know, should we show the 2-minute video of Kimberly talking about that? Okay. All right. Here we go. Kimberly, I think lights.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identity. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit, it is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
Okay, so that was encouraging on why it's been important for us to talk about all these things, and we still haven't gotten to the queer people yet. But the intersectionality is so important, like how all these things come together. And understanding that will help us understand the situation.
Yeah. And so now we get to the queer folk. After World War I, we're familiar with the Great Migration from the South. This is a period when soldiers were coming back, the South, and were recognizing that while they're in Europe fighting for freedom, they come back to the United States and don't have the freedoms that they're fighting for in Europe. Also, conditions in the South during Jim Crow are so bad that folks start migrating to the North for jobs and for freedom. And so the Great Migration involves hundreds of thousands of black folk migrating from the southern states to Chicago, places like New York, and another part of the migration to Los Angeles in the West. But the folks who are going to New York are people from all over the country, and there's this burgeoning intellectual movement that happens, and not only in Harlem, but all over the country, and it's called the Harlem Renaissance. And the Harlem Renaissance was a period of what they used to call salons, where black people were getting together, and it was an amazing period of writers, musicians, dancers who were having a dialogue around re-engaging their own humanity as black people. The Harlem Renaissance was not necessarily for outside consumption. There were conversations around, after coming out of slavery and Jim Crow, how do we recognize that we are beautiful, amazing, talented people who need to see ourselves as fully human beings in order for us to fight for our rights. And so one of the leaders of the Harlem Renaissance we know as Langston Hughes, who lived from 1920 until about 1935. I'm sorry, 1902, thank you. And one of the reasons I wanted to include him as a leader was because he spent a good portion of that time writing a column in Chicago for the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender was one of the most important newspapers in the entire United States, because it was the organ that communicated not only to blacks who had moved to Chicago, but it was a national newspaper that communicated what was happening in black communities around the country. So Langston Hughes also worked to humanize people. And I'm just going to read this poem really quickly that he wrote, because I think it's powerful in terms of this rehumanizing of black people. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll sit at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. This is what the Harlem Renaissance was about. There were novels written. Can you name some of the Harlem Renaissance writers that you know? Some of the musicians, some of the dancers?
County Cullen, Catherine Dunham, or she was actually started here, I guess.
Zora Hurston.
Arna Bontemps.
Claude McKay.
Elaine Locke. Before that, I guess he was really the predecessor of.
That's right. And Lorraine Hansberry. And so most of the names of the people that you mentioned were queer people. Lorraine Hansberry was a lesbian. Claude McKay was a gay man. Langston Hughes was a gay man. And this was a period, County Cullen was also a gay man, exactly. So many of these folks were gay and lesbian people in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. And they were expressing themselves not only in terms of their sexuality, but their humanity as the leaders of the artistic movement that expressed their humanity. And this is why their work became important, but their work was built upon work that had been done by others. Now, you mentioned Alain Locke. Alain Locke was interesting because he was considered to be a philosopher. I think it was Martin Luther King who talked about the fact that we don't know much about philosophers who are black. He said they are among us right now, and Alain Locke was one of them. He lived from 1922 until 1997. Those years are important because as a philosopher, Alain Locke talked about black people, but he also nurtured a lot of people. One of the people he nurtured that we're going to talk about in more detail in a moment is a man named Bayard Rustin. So let me skip one. But before we go to Bayard Rustin, I want to share, Nanette's going to share the story of another woman who was instrumental in the civil rights movement, and her name was Pauli Murray.
Pauli Murray, 1910 to 1985, she was a brilliant attorney whose strategy and her voluminous research really informed the civil rights movement a lot, the litigation at all levels. Based on her collected papers, which are archived at Radcliffe College, some historians say that if she were alive today, she would be considered trans. She wrote this amazing autobiography, and in her autobiography, she does not mention sexuality at all, which is really interesting to me. I just finished reading this. It's a 20-hour audio book, voluminous, and I strongly encourage you to look for this, called Song in a Weary Throat, Polly Murray. She lived her life. She was a leader. She did what she was called to do. She was rejected from the University of North Carolina Law School because she was a woman. They were accepting black men to law school there, but not women. So here was an experience of intersectionality. She went to Howard University Law School instead in the 40s, and as Derrick mentioned, there at the university, the students were making all of the arguments about how to overturn Jim Crow. And there, Polly also coined the term Jane Crow because of her intersectional experience as a woman of being disrespected there in that setting. The students there at Howard University took part in sit-ins. They went into some of the segregated facilities in African American communities near Howard University and started doing sit-ins in the early 1940s. And they actually learned that they could have success. They integrated some of the segregated lunch counters there, but Howard University administrators told them they had to stop because Howard had a lot of funding from the federal government, and so there was that economic pressure. But they had learned, the students had learned, that it could work. 20 years before the Greensboro sit-ins started in Greensboro. Also in 1940, Polly Murray was arrested on an interstate bus. She was arrested in Virginia for refusing to go to the rear of the bus. She was traveling with her friend home for Easter. And in 1946, 6 years later, there was a Supreme Court case that was about this woman, Irene Morgan. The woman pictured here is Irene Morgan, not Polly Murray. But this Supreme Court case said that commerce laws required that there not be segregation on the buses that go interstate. This was about interstate travel. But Virginia still had segregated everything, and when you were in Virginia, you could be forced back into segregation. So the Supreme Court said that was not constitutional. But of course, by 1961, the segregation was still happening, and then we got the freedom rides that we know about with the buses, and the pictures we have of buses in flames as people fought back against that. But in the 40s, 20 years earlier, the students, and Polly Murray among them, were laying the groundwork. Murray graduated at the top of her class at Howard Law School, and one of her seminar papers at Howard was used by Thurgood Marshall and others at the NAACP in their legal strategy and their arguments in Brown versus Board of Education. She also wrote a voluminous book in which she collated all the state's laws on race and color, and Thurgood Marshall called that the Bible for civil rights lawyers. After they used it in some of those civil rights cases, it began to become so out of date so quickly because all of the laws were changing through the litigation. But the students at Howard University, and Polly Murray significantly among them, laid a foundation that could be used in that work. In 1971, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was not yet on the Supreme Court, but she was writing about the Reed versus Reed, which was a gender discrimination case, and she cited Polly Murray as a co-author with her of that, even though Polly didn't help write it. But Polly's work was so instrumental and informative that she gave her credit by saying she co-authored this with her. Polly Murray has a long list of accomplishments. She ultimately became the first African American woman and the first woman ordained to the Episcopal priesthood. And in 2012, she was named an Episcopal saint, which to Episcopalians means this is a person upon whom you should meditate. You should meditate on her life. And
I am one of those Episcopalians who is very proud of Polly Murray.
Yes. So, very quick snapshot of Polly.
Thank you. I love Polly Murray. If you're ever in Durham, North Carolina, there's a Polly Murray House and Center that you should see in Durham. Yes. Durham, North Carolina, yes. The next person we want to talk about is Bayard Rustin. Like Pauli Murray, we are both pained to have to go through these biographies so quickly. It's very difficult. But Bayard Rustin was an amazing figure in the civil rights movement. He was a Quaker. He was raised by Quaker grandparents, and he was a Quaker himself. And I think mentioning Pauli Murray as an Episcopalian and Bayard Rustin as a Quaker is very important because it reminds us of the source of that faith provided for these African American leaders during the civil rights movement. As a Quaker, Bayard Rustin believed in nonviolence, and what he's known for primarily is giving the gift of nonviolent resistance to the civil rights movement. Again, as a Quaker, he understood this. At one point, he went to India. Although Gandhi had passed by that point, he learned a lot about the nonviolence resistance from his time in India, particularly as a Quaker. During the early part of the civil rights movement, he visited Martin Luther King and had a conversation, and he and Martin Luther King became very good friends. In fact, Bayard Rustin was something of a mentor toward Martin Luther King, and they had a lot of intellectual conversations about how to shape the civil rights movement. When Martin Luther King was struggling with trying to figure out how to place himself in that movement, it was Bayard Rustin who advised him. Now, Bayard Rustin was also known for many other things during his journey. He became a communist. Many African Americans became communists at the time because of communist promise. But when the Communist Party turned their backs on black people and turned toward the Soviet Union, Bayard Rustin left the Communist Party, but some of his sensibilities remained. In 1944, during the freedom rides to the South, Bayard Rustin was one of the first African Americans who was arrested while he was on one of the buses, and the police got on the bus and demanded that he move his seat to a blacks-only session. Bayard Rustin looked at a white boy who was sitting near him and said, "I refuse to move my seat because what would moving communicate to this white boy about his superiority and my inferiority?" He not only refused to move, but he was dragged off the bus and was sent to a chain gang where he spent a period of several months, I think so. 6 months or so, on a chain gang where he was chained and doing road work. And that also influenced him. He was sent to a high security prison at that period. And later he joined the Journey of Reconciliation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the other thing about Bayard Rustin, not only was he gay in the 1930s, but he was unabashedly gay. He flaunted his sexuality, he had all kinds of sexual partners, and he did not care what anybody thought about that, which made him an amazing character. He was charismatic, and he had a lot of followers. At a certain point, because he was openly gay, people did not quite know what to do with him. He was targeted by the FBI. And at a certain point in 1953, I believe, while he was in Pasadena, California, he was arrested on a morals charge. He was caught having sex with 2 white men in an automobile in Pasadena, and he was arrested. The FBI and others who were trying to put down the civil rights movement used this against him, and he was actually ashamed. Not ashamed of his sexuality, but ashamed that he had made the mistake of being caught. And this created a change. The other thing that happened around that time was because he had been caught and had a records with the morals charge, the FBI threatened Martin Luther King and said, if you keep consorting with Bayard Rustin, we will put out in the media that you, Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin, are sexually involved with each other. This caused Martin Luther King and others, I'm forgetting the name of, Clayton Powell, thank you. Clayton Powell, who was powerful in the movement, influenced Martin Luther King to sever ties with Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin became very depressed, although he kept into the movement. But this caused Bayard Rustin to say, this is a quote from Bayard, "I know now that for me, sex must be sublimated if I am to live with myself and in this world longer." He knew that he would have to sublimate his sexuality in order to stay involved in the movement, although for many, many years he was separated and estranged from Martin Luther King and others in the movement. Eventually he came back to the movement and he became the leader and the organizer of the March on Washington. The March on Washington would not have happened had it not been for Bayard Rustin. Eventually Bayard and Martin Luther King reconciled and they worked together, and Bayard Rustin continued doing civil rights work until he died years later. Bayard Rustin was not known by many people until just a few years ago, when a documentary on his life and a book was published, his biography called Brother Outsider. You can find that documentary, which chronicles all of this, online today, and his book is available. Bayard Rustin was a powerful figure who was not known as the man, again, who gave the gift of the nonviolent resistance to the civil rights movement, an advisor to Martin Luther King, and the organizer on the March on Washington.
Something just happened this week or last.
He was pardoned by the state of California for that arrest in Pasadena. Just, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago. Thank you for mentioning that.
Week.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so his record was expunged, and it's a great.
His name was not known as powerful as he was until a few years ago, simply because, and because he removed himself with that quote, he removed himself even though he was one of the most powerful leaders. He knew that he could not be gay and a leader of the movement at the same time. And that's really powerful with folks like Pauli Murray and Bayard Rustin, because how many times do we let our movements be controlled by people who are gay because they are inconvenient in the movement? It happens throughout history.
And again, that's that intersectionality, the lavender scare, the red scare, and the segregationists used this as a weapon. They targeted people with it, and we are going to do a roll call for you here. We have 5 minutes left, and we knew we'd get to this point. Yeah.
I was just going to share as a personal anecdote. Both my parents were very active and prominent in the civil rights movement, and I never knew the Bayard Rustin name until I was an adult, an old adult.
Yes.
So that's just testament to the power of the intimidation.
Yes. Yeah. If you once you know to look for him, there are many pictures of King where he's standing just back behind King while King's giving a talk. Definitely at the March on Washington, you see him there. So we are about to do a roll call with our last 5 minutes and throw a lot of names your way. We know that this could be a whole semester class. And we had to do a lot of research, as I mentioned, because people have been hidden. Some of them hid their own sexuality, but studies have begun to be done. Here's a dissertation that we found that's all about queer leadership in the civil rights movement. Did not have time to read that whole thing. But we got a few names from it, and we found out about some people that we did not know about. But we're having this conversation for a few important reasons. You want to say a couple of things about that?
I think some of it is the reason that I just mentioned. These are names that we don't know, and we should, because these folks have sacrificed. And I think also because of the link between the suppression of people's identities is a direct result of white supremacy. White supremacy seeks to oppress and silence anything that does not seem to serve white supremacy, including the power of queer people in our society. And I think it's also important because it's important for us to recognize how our institutions even today silence the voices of queer people. We have all kinds of mythology, particularly around black queer people, that black people are more homophobic than other people, all of these types of things. And if we don't understand intersectionality, then we'll never understand how we resist white supremacy, because all of these things, gender, sexuality, race, are all products of white supremacy. And it's important for us to understand that we're not just talking about the Klan. We're talking about all of us who don't understand or don't seek to understand things like gender expression and the pronouns like we talked about. That if we don't fully understand these things, then we're not fully understanding the power of white supremacy. And it doesn't take much to look around our society and our political culture today to see all of these things continually playing out. If we suppress voices of people like queer black folks, then what that suggests is those people are not there, and representation is very important. And one of the reasons that Harold Washington in Chicago was known as a gay black man. And one of the reasons his power was somewhat limited, as powerful as he was because of the same kind of threats and intimidation. It's important that we have these conversations and recognize these people and the history that they have given us in Chicago and in the world.
So now a roll call. These are some of the people that you can learn more about. We encourage you to go looking. First, I want to mention Gladys Bentley, because we skipped over a picture of her in the time of the Harlem Renaissance, but she was a gender-bending performer called the most famous lesbian in the Harlem Renaissance. Now I forgot her name, I just said it. Gladys Bentley. Aaron Henry. He did the Freedom Ballot, laid the groundwork for Freedom Summer and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You see all those young faces, how young they were, peopling the movement. Aaron Henry did so many things, started movements. Ernestine Eckstein, a lesbian African-American woman who worked with the gay rights movement, a member of Daughters of Bilitis, and a member of Black Women Organized for Action. Barbara Jordan, the first African-American elected to the Texas Senate and the first woman and African-American elected to Congress from Texas. She had a life partner of 30 years, Nancy Earl. Sylvia Rivera, born Puerto Rican Venezuelan boy in the Bronx, New York, was active in Stonewall and the Stonewall riots, the beginning of gay liberation, involved with Puerto Rican and African American youth activism. Worked with Marsha P. Johnson, another transgender rights activist. There's a show on Netflix right now that you can watch and learn about Marsha P. Johnson. We encourage you to go look for her.
Can I say something quickly about Marsha P. Johnson and Rivera? When we think about Stonewall, they were involved with the Stonewall uprising. And I think they're very important because that story has been whitewashed. When we hear about Stonewall, the message that we were given was that Stonewall was being driven by gay white men. Stonewall was driven by African American and Puerto Rican, gay, lesbian, and trans women. And that is important for us to understand in the history of the gay liberation movement. Yeah. People like Marsha P. Henson and Sylvia Rivera were instrumental in launching that resistance movement.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Crystal Jang, co-founder of Asian Pacific Islander Queer Women, Transgender Community, Older Asian Sisters in Solidarity. Pedro Zamora, a Cuban-American AIDS educator and TV personality, first openly gay man portrayed in popular media. James Baldwin, we know his writing, Notes of a Native Son, Giovanni's Room. He has a famous lecture, Race, Racism, and the Gay Community. Audre Lorde, Women Are Powerful and Dangerous. She said, I write for those women who do not speak, for those who do not have a voice, because they were so terrified. Because we are taught to respect fear more than ourselves. We've been taught that silence would save us, but it won't.
She has a powerful poem you might look up called There Is No Hierarchy of Oppressions.
Andrea Jenkins, first trans woman elected to public office. I think she's in Minnesota. Miss Major Griffin Gracie, a trans activist who herself experienced homelessness and incarceration and continues to work to support other trans individuals. Willie Ninja, who was instrumental in creating voguing, which Madonna had a hit about, Strike a Pose. Black gay men were doing that in the clubs for a long time before Madonna was. Alvin Ailey founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater in 1958. It's globally recognized. It started as a black modern dance troupe, and with him.
Yes.
Yep. Say a word.
So I'd like to name Reverend Juan Reed. Juan Reed was my priest at St. Martin's Episcopal Church. He was openly gay and black and had a hard time in Chicago. He's important because not only was he my mentor, but he has mentored a lot of gay and lesbian people in Chicago. He's in the Chicago Gay and Lesbian Hall of Fame. He was an Episcopal priest and a Catholic monk for many years. He's a social worker and a therapist, and is a counselor for many people in Chicago, particular black gay men and women and clergy who are active in the Episcopal Diocese and other religious bodies in the city of Chicago. He's an amazing mentor to many of us, including Jamie Frazier,
who is currently acting in Boys Town right here. He has a church called the Lighthouse Church, and he has started the Lighthouse Foundation. They've been organizing against racism happening in Boys Town right now in Chicago. They were able to build community and confront the Howard Brown Center that had been employing a very racist security guard, and they got the Howard Brown Center to get a new security provider. Jamie has told me stories of how they've gone to certain institutions, certain stores that have been very racist in their treatment, and they've had success to the point where some of those stores have now put signs in their windows saying they're undergoing anti-racism training and they're welcoming of all people. So they are continuing to build a movement and have an impact here in Chicago. And the handouts that we provided for you were information about this, because any individuals who are committed to the pursuit of justice for Black LGBTQ plus people, anyone is welcome to join that movement, and they have activities for people of color and for white allies as well. So those papers will give you information about that and how to find out more, how to even become a member and a supporter of that movement.
One quick thing I want to add is that in Chicago, the homeless population among Black and Latino LGBTQ people is astronomical, particularly on the south and west sides. Boys Town and places like that are considered to be gay communities in Chicago are very hostile toward Black, queer young men and women and trans people. And so it's important to know that they're often invisible, and people like Jamie and Juan Reed, who are fighting in those communities, have a really difficult time. And so one thing you can do is support their work, follow their work, and be aware of what's going on in those communities that are often invisible in the city of Chicago, in our churches, in our communities, and all of our institutions. That's also why we have this conversation. The work continues by people like Jamie Frazier, and it's important to be aware of that.
And with that, we are out of time. We wish we had time to sit and chat with you more, but thank you for coming, and we'll be here for a couple of minutes if you want.
Yeah.